awful attack. Taliban denying that they carried this out. What do you think about that? First of all, who did carry it out? And if it was the Taliban, why would they then deny it?
Thanks for having me, Tom, and thanks for mentioning, as always, my Navy Reserve affiliation. As a reminder, as I'm not on duty, these views are my own. It's, as you said, just absolutely tragic and unconscionable to think about people perpetrating such an attack. There's hardly words. I'm reading the interview this morning from the principal of that school and what she went through on Saturday. So to your question, who's responsible? And this is part of the complexity of the environment, is the Taliban in some ways is a political party because they do have a spokesperson, right? But there would certainly, just like in any political party, be certain people that wouldn't mind going off and doing splinter operations, which would allow the Afghan government to blame the Taliban as a whole. Separately, there might be groups that would have a motivation for there to be even more tension and violence between the Afghan government and the Taliban. And if this is what they did, then this would have actually succeeded for them because the Afghan government did blame the Taliban publicly. So even if we don't know who's behind it, what you can see is the result is there are factions within the Taliban and, of course, opinions within the Afghan government that make this more complex. And, of course, this is clearly done with the timing of the setting of this last week and the next several weeks being part of the U.S. and allies' withdrawal from Afghanistan.
And let's hope that doesn't set a precedent. As I said, you see that vision and basically the crime of girls wanting to go off and learn being targeted. How does this fit into that US withdrawal? One of the achievements when people said, was it worth the war, was this push for girls in particular to be able to go off and get educated and transform their lives. Is that still going to be a priority without presence of the West?
So you bring up the perfect question. Is it a priority, right? If you're looking at this from the Pentagon perspective, from the Department of Defense, how it is difficult to sit in meetings and say, okay, the U.S. national interest is to protect Americans at first, both at home and abroad. And you look at this and you say, okay, well, we've been in Afghanistan for 2 decades. What is the exit strategy, or do we just pull out? It is so difficult when you're briefed and you know that attacks like this will happen. You can predict them. We can predict that more of them will happen, particularly as these factions seek to both show that the U.S. Lost the conflict and try to portray it as that, but also as they seek regional power themselves in the power vacuum. You know it's going to happen, and that's a very difficult decision to make when you're looking at defense. When it comes to the actual prioritization of helping Afghanistan create a secure environment, it's going to happen outside of a U.S. military presence, obviously, which does remove leverage that the U.S. and allies had at the table in Afghanistan. So it makes it very difficult to think that, unfortunately, there are going to be further attacks like this.
Hard to hear, but yes, suspect you are right. India-EU trade talks, meanwhile. Look, this is interesting to look at. I know you look at it through the prism of alliances, and you've got this broader picture where the West really wants India to be an important bulwark against China, but India is also being, wooed on multiple fronts economically.
That's right. And it's always important to see which alliances are trying to form, which ones are sort of backing off. And the timing this week of India and the EU, this is the first time an India Prime Minister has attended a full session of the European Union leaders that Prime Minister Modi said, yes, we're very interested in having these talks. Now, before we get our hopes up about the efficacy of this, the last time they tried, it took about 6 years, and they ultimately walked away because there were just too many details that couldn't work out. But it is a symbol to show that the European Union, trying to get more involved in the Indo-Pacific, particularly as China is a strategic competitor, is willing to have talks with India over a free trade agreement. And if you look at the very colorful language, both sides are talking about the great promise and the great excitement they have over this.
It's a very closed and protected economy, so that will be the difficult part of the negotiations, of course. We also had this news that the strategic economic dialogue is what it's described as. Mm-hmm. Well, China's ending it with Australia. Does this have any impact? I mean, they've done this anyway, in effect, except for all the stuff they're still buying from us, which hasn't changed, in particular iron ore.
Yes, the announcement this past week that China publicly canceled the China-Australia strategic economic dialogue, it doesn't have necessarily a practical impact immediately. It is symbolic, saying that China recognizes, and I think in their announcement they said that Australia has a Cold War mentality and should be treated as such, and so they don't want to have that dialogue. Not much of a practical practical impact. But back to the previous point about the EU-India discussions, what alliances are sort of on the way in and which ones are on the way out? It's just symbolic that Australia and China are not going to hold that dialogue. The only practical effect is it doesn't allow staffers below the ministerial level to communicate anymore. And as we know, any one of these annual or biannual meetings, a lot of the work actually happens when the staffers talk. So it does cut off those lines of communication, which does have a practical effect. But it certainly is one of these.
It's a good point.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a good point. So we've just got 30 seconds left. I know you want to talk about this new drone that's been launched, or drones from the US towards Japan. I'm going to ask you just a quick question on this. How long can these things fly for before they get refueled? They're a real wonder of technology, aren't they?
Yes, they can fly about 24 to 30 hours, which is why they're preferable over the manned aircraft. It's in some ways. Of course, they don't react in the same way, but they're flown by a pilot and co-pilot on the ground. Australia, interestingly, has ordered several of these, and I believe that they're currently going to be delivered to the Royal Australian Air Force in 2024. So right now, it's just a US and Australian capability, and the US is deploying this capability for the first time to Japan. They just announced that this week.